that changed Canadian views on Afghanistan. It was not the Taliban mistreatment of women, I can assure you. As early as 1995, the Center for Peace Studies of McMaster University, of which I was then director, went hat in hand to Foreign Affairs and CEDA to point out the desperate conditions in Afghanistan, including the desperate conditions of women. Women were already being mistreated and had been for years. And to ask that increased funding be given, both for reconstruction in Afghanistan and for peace building in that country. And we were told bluntly by both agencies that Afghanistan was not high on the list of Canadian priorities. What changed that? 9/11 changed that, along with pressure after 9/11 from the United States government. What then has been the principal language used in Canada to portray and justify the Afghanistan adventure and the broader policy changes in a way that ordinary Canadians could accept? If Canadians weren't prepared to accept the freedom narrative, the global war on terror narrative, and by the way, the Canadian government on the whole has been quite leery about using that term, global war on terror. They know Canadians don't go for it. I'm going to give you one of the more sophisticated examples here of how this has been portrayed in Canada. There are many unsophisticated examples, but here is one of the more sophisticated. So this is from 2008, the Independent Panel on Canada's Future Role in Afghanistan. We usually call it the Manley Panel because John Manley chaired it. And here's how it sets the context of Canada's military involvement in Afghanistan. It was from Afghanistan that al-Qaeda leaders planned and directed the terrorist attacks of September 11, 2001 against targets in the United States. The day after 9/11, the UN Security Council formally recognized the right of individual and collective self-defense and called on all member states to cooperate in Afghanistan to bring to justice the perpetrators, organizers, and sponsors of these terrorist attacks. This is no crude essay by Rick Hillier, Gordon O'Connor, or Stephen Harper. We are not, for example, urged, as Hillier put it, to fight detestable murderers and scumbags. We're told about multilateralism, about the United Nations, about the UN Charter and international law. In other words, Manley's fiddle is playing the tune Canadians like to hear. Unfortunately, Manley's version, too, is deceptive. Let's ignore the top paragraph for a moment, which of course is the main theme, and I'll be getting to that one later. Even the second paragraph, however, is deceptive. Most readers will assume on reading this second paragraph that on September 12th, the Security Council called for military action against Afghanistan. It did no such thing. UN Security Council 1368 does not call for military action against any state, nor does it call for member states to, quote, cooperate in Afghanistan. It does not even mention Afghanistan, any more than it mentions the Taliban or al-Qaeda. While the preamble of the resolution may be seen as laying a basis for possible future military action, the body of the resolution stops far short of calling for this. It insists that the events of 9/11 were acts of terrorism and should be dealt with through the implementation of existing conventions and resolutions. It's one of a series of Security Council resolutions against terrorism, to which UNSC 1269 and the later UNSC 1373 belong, that call for the use of judicial and other non-military means to suppress terrorism and bring perpetrators to justice. You will find that this series of resolutions uses terms such as apprehension, extradition, and prosecution of terrorists. Did John Manley and his panel not understand the difference between invading and occupying a country and implementing international law by apprehending and trying suspects against whom a reasonable case had been made? Most people in the world seem to have understood the point. A Gallup poll carried out in 37 countries in late September 2001 found that apart from the US, Israel, and India, a majority of people in every country, in other words, a majority of people in 34 out of 37 countries, preferred extradition and trial of suspects to a US attack on Afghanistan. In other words, they felt law was a better route than war to address terrorism. Moreover, even in the United States, where support for military action was strong after 9/11, there was also strong support for non-military approaches, including those using international law. A 2002 poll, Chicago Council on Foreign Relations and the German Marshall Fund of the United States, found that 83% of Americans wanted to see suspected terrorists tried in an international, not American, criminal court. This is striking when we consider the determination with which the Bush administration attempted to sideline and weaken the nascent International Criminal Court. And what were the proposed targets of U.S. military action doing at this time? Although you may have not read too much about it in the press, the Taliban were offering after 9/11 to have bin Laden apprehended and subjected to a legal process. The most detailed of their proposals would have had bin Laden extradited to Pakistan, where evidence implicating him in the crimes of 9/11 would be placed before an international tribunal. The tribunal would then decide whether to try him itself or hand him over to the United States. The president of Pakistan, Mr. Musharraf, vetoed this plan, almost certainly at the order of the United States. Other plans suggested by the Taliban were rejected outright by the United States. Typical comment from Mr. Bush. This is October 14th, 2001. There's no need to negotiate. There's no discussions. Turn them over. If they want us to stop our military operations, they've just got to meet my conditions. Now, when I said no negotiation, I meant no negotiation. And I always find it interesting when using the law is simply called negotiation, and in turn that's supposed to be an indication of weakness. It was George W. Bush who on September 12th publicly defined the attacks of 9/11 as an act of war. He wanted them to be acts of war so he could respond with acts of war. His precise words were, "The deliberate and deadly attacks which were carried out yesterday against our country were more than acts of terror, they were acts of war," unquote. The Manley panel, in what I can only assume was a conscious act of deception, pretended this legitimation of war was carried out by the United Nations, thereby, of course, satisfying the Canadian national narrative. Please consider how important the distinction is between judicial process and war. Any decent modern judicial process accepts the presumption of innocence and requires that guilt be demonstrated through the presentation of evidence and argument. War, on the other hand, as an institution, depends not on evidence and truth-seeking, but on belligerent unification of the nation, so that the nation as a unified force may hurl itself against the enemy. War makers will use evidence, typically, and argument when they are helpful in the task of national unification, and they will discard or manipulate them when they are unhelpful. And so it was with the invasion of Afghanistan. Neither serious evidence nor serious argument was put forth. On the eve of the invasion of Afghanistan, October 3rd, Tony Blair's government made the rash decision to make a case of sorts against bin Laden and by implication the Taliban in a document entitled Responsibility for the Terrorist Atrocities in the United States, 11 September 2001. This document, which presumably summarizes the same evidence used to bring NATO on board the previous day, is stunningly weak. Most of the evidence does not even rise to the level of circumstantial. As an eminent British lawyer commented at the time, and I'm quoting, this is from the London Times, October 5th, "It is a sobering thought that better evidence is required to prosecute a shoplifter than is needed to commence a world war." By world war, he's talking about the global war on terror, of which this attack on Afghanistan was to be the opening shot. Where does all this leave Canadians? What must we do in a general sense with regard to 9/11 under these circumstances? It seems to me we must do exactly the opposite of what is demanded or expected of us by our government, which is to say, we must repudiate the taboo against the examination of the events of 9/11. These events were extremely important historically for our country and for the world.